Welcome, everyone. We're diving deep today into Galatians 1.124.
Yeah, a really powerful section of the New Testament.
We'll break down Paul's message, the historical context, and most importantly, what it means for us today.
You know, these verses are like a foundation for the whole letter to the Galatians,
They give us a peek into the early days of Christianity.
the challenges they faced.
Exactly. And right from the get-go, Paul makes this bold statement. He calls himself an apostle,
Chosen by Jesus himself,
not by some human authority.
which is huge, especially when you consider his background.
Right. So why was this claim so controversial?
Well, think about it. Paul was this fierce opponent of the early church.
He was all about Jewish law and tradition.
Deeply devoted.
And then suddenly he's like, nope, I'm appointed by Jesus.
It's like a total 180.
Imagine someone switching sides in a huge rivalry.
Yeah, that's the kind of shock this caused.
And then he goes even further. He says anyone preaching a different gospel should be condemned.
Even an angel from heaven.
Whoa. No mincing words there.
So what was going on back then that made him so passionate about this?
It sounds intense.
It was. The early church was grappling with some serious issues, especially in the region of Galatia.
There were these groups called Judaizers, right?
Yeah, they believed that Gentile converts to Christianity had to follow Jewish law to be truly saved.
Like circumcision.
Exactly. And Paul saw this as a direct threat to the message of freedom and grace that Jesus taught.
So he's basically saying, it's not about the rules and rituals. It's about faith in Jesus.
That's it in a nutshell.
A debate that still echoes today in different forms.
We might not argue about circumcision anymore, but we still wrestle with what's truly essential for faith.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about Paul's wild transformation. From persecuting the church to becoming its champion.
It's a story for the ages.
He went from trying to destroy the church to building it up.
It's incredible. Paul himself describes his past as a time when he was incredibly zealous for Jewish tradition.
He even persecuted and harmed early Christians.
He was relentless.
Imagine the guilt he must have felt later.
It's hard to fathom.
And then comes this life-changing moment when he encounters Jesus.
On the road to Damascus?
A blinding light, a voice from heaven. It's like something out of a movie.
But it was real. And it changed everything for Paul.
It wasn't just a change of mind, it was a complete turnaround.
It's a total transformation.
Yeah, from enemy to advocate. Powerful stuff.
It really is.
Now, one thing that really struck me is that after this encounter, Paul doesn't rush to meet the other apostles.
He does his own thing for a while.
Yeah, he goes to Arabia, then Damascus.
And he only visits Peter in Jerusalem 3 years later.
Why do you think he did that?
Some scholars believe he was intentionally distancing himself from the other apostles.
To emphasize his independent authority.
Exactly. He was claiming to have received his message directly from Jesus. After all,
It's almost like he's saying, I've got my own mandate. I don't need to run it by anyone else.
it's a bold move.
And it probably ruffled some feathers.
Oh, definitely. There must have been some tension there.
I mean, think about it. You've got these established leaders who've been with Jesus.
And then this guy comes along claiming direct revelation.
It's bound to cause some friction.
That Paul was convinced of his calling,
And he wasn't afraid to stand up for what he believed in?
even if it meant going against the grain.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that sometimes we have to chart our own course.
Even when it's difficult or unpopular.
Now, during his visit to Jerusalem, Paul briefly mentions seeing James, the Lord's brother.
An interesting detail.
What do we know about James?
Well, he was a significant figure in the early church.
He was seen as a leader in the Jerusalem community.
And according to some early traditions, he was even considered the head of the church in Jerusalem.
So why do you think Paul mentions him?
It could be a way of acknowledging the existing leadership.
While still asserting his own independent authority.
Right. It's like he's saying, I'm not trying to overthrow anyone, but I do have a unique message to share.
A delicate balance.
Sure.
So we've got Paul, this former persecutor turned passionate preacher.
A man transformed by grace.
And he's laying the groundwork for a powerful message.
A message that would challenge the status quo.
And change the course of history.
Exactly. So stay tuned as we continue our deep dive into Galatians 1.124. We're just getting started.
There's so much more to unpack.
And it's all incredibly relevant for our lives today.
So buckle up and get ready for some mind-blowing insights.
It's going to be a wild ride. It's really fascinating. You know how Paul's personal journey shapes his message?
Yes, all intertwined.
His experiences, his struggles, his transformation, it all feeds into his understanding of the gospel.
Absolutely. And speaking of his journey, we left off talking about his time in Arabia, that mysterious period after his conversion.
Right. He doesn't immediately go to Jerusalem to connect with the other apostles.
He goes off the grid for a while.
Almost like a self-imposed exile.
What do you think was going on in his head during that time?
It had to be intense. Think about it. He'd just had this radical encounter with Jesus.
His whole world was turned upside down.
Exactly. He needed time to process it all, to grapple with the implications,
To figure out what it meant for his life.
and for his understanding of God.
It's like he needed to integrate this massive revelation into his whole being.
It wasn't just a new idea, it was a total paradigm shift.
And maybe he also needed time to develop his own unique perspective on the gospel.
Remember, he keeps emphasizing that his message came directly from Jesus.
Not from any human authority,
So perhaps Arabia was where he solidified that understanding.
where he truly owned his calling.
It's like he's saying, I need to hear from God directly before I go comparing notes with anyone else.
Yeah, it shows a real commitment to personal revelation.
And a boldness to follow his own path.
Yeah.
Which, as we'll see, gets him into some trouble later on.
Oh, yeah. He definitely ruffles some feathers.
But he's not afraid to stand apart, even from the other apostles, if he believes it's necessary to defend the truth of the gospel.
As he understands it.
Exactly. He's not seeking their approval or trying to fit into their molds.
He's got his own thing going on.
And it's a good reminder for us, too. You know, sometimes the most important conversations we have.
Are the ones we have with ourselves.
And with God.
Even if they take us away from the crowd for a while.
We live in such a noisy world.
So much information coming at us from
Yeah.
all directions.
It's easy to get swept up in the opinions and perspectives of others.
And lose sight of our own inner voice.
Exactly. So taking time for solitude, for reflection, for listening to that still small voice within.
That's crucial.
Absolutely. Now, eventually, Paul does make his way to Jerusalem.
After his time in Arabia.
And he mentions spending 15 days with Peter.
And he briefly mentions seeing James the Lord's brother.
It's interesting that he includes those details.
Why do you think that is?
Well, it could be a way of anticipating pushback from those who might question his authority.
Right. Some people might say, well, if you're a real apostle, why didn't you go straight to the big guys in Jerusalem?
Exactly. So he's addressing that preemptively by saying, look, I did meet with them, but it was brief, and it wasn't about getting their stamp of approval.
It's a subtle but powerful way of reinforcing his claim.
That his gospel comes straight from the source,
Jesus himself.
not from the other apostles.
He's not trying to fit into their mold or get their blessing.
He's walking this fine line between establishing his connection to them, showing he's not some rogue agent,
While also asserting his independence.
and the unique nature of his calling.
And it's worth noting that he doesn't go into detail about what they discussed.
He's not saying, Peter told me this, or James agreed with me on that.
He keeps the focus on his direct revelation from Christ.
Which is really important. It reminds us that the Christian faith isn't about blindly following human authority.
Or adhering to a rigid set of rules.
It's about a personal relationship with Jesus
About receiving his grace.
and allowing it to transform our lives.
It's like he's saying, you don't need a mediator to connect with God. You can have your own direct experience of his love and grace.
And that's a powerful message that transcends time and culture.
Absolutely. Now, so far, we've been focusing a lot on Paul's authority and his backstory.
Right. But let's zoom in on the content of his message in these opening verses of Galatians.
He's writing to the Galatians because he's heard some disturbing news. They're being swayed by a different version of the gospel.
A different gospel.
Yeah, it's pretty alarming. What was so different about these other gospels that had him so fired up?
Well, remember those Judaizers we talked about earlier?
The ones who believed Gentile converts had to follow Jewish law.
Exactly. They were the ones pushing this idea that circumcision and other Jewish practices were essential for salvation.
They were basically adding extra requirements onto the message of grace that Paul was preaching.
It was like they were saying, yeah, Jesus is great, but you also need to do all these other things to be saved.
So it wasn't just a theological debate.
Mhm.
It was a clash of cultures and religious practices.
And it had huge implications for the future of the church.
Was it going to be an exclusive club for those who followed Jewish law? Or was it going to be open to everyone?
That was the question at stake.
And Paul saw these other gospels as a threat to the very heart of the Christian faith.
He believed that salvation came through faith in Jesus Christ alone.
Not through following a set of rules or rituals.
It was all about grace, God's free gift of forgiveness and new life,
And that grace was available to everyone.
regardless of their background or their ability to perfectly follow the law.
It was a radical message of inclusivity and freedom.
And it directly challenged the views of the Judaizers.
No wonder Paul was so passionate about defending his view.
He was fighting for the souls of the Galatians.
He truly believed that their eternal destiny was at stake.
And that comes through in the strong language he uses.
He doesn't hold back. He calls out those who are distorting the gospel message.
And leading people astray.
He even says that anyone who preaches a different gospel should be eternally condemned.
It's intense.
But it shows you how seriously he took this issue.
This wasn't just an academic debate for him. It was a matter of life and death.
Spiritual life and death.
Exactly. And I think it's something we can sometimes forget when we read these ancient texts.
They weren't just abstract ideas for Paul.
They were matters of ultimate importance.
With real-world consequences.
It was about spiritual freedom versus spiritual bondage.
Paul believed that these other gospels were enslaving people to a system of rules and rituals.
Robbing them of the true freedom that Christ offered.
And that's a battle that's still being fought today.
In different forms.
We still face pressures to conform,
To earn God's favor.
to measure up to certain standards.
But Paul's message reminds us that true freedom comes from accepting God's grace.
Not from trying to earn it.
It's a message that transcends time and culture.
It speaks to the deepest longings of the human heart.
The longing for acceptance, belonging, and unconditional love.
And that's what makes Paul's letter to the Galatians so relevant even today.
It's a timeless message of grace, freedom, and the power of God's love to transform our lives. You know, as we wrap up our look at Galatians 1:1-4, it's amazing how much Paul packs into these verses.
It's like a crash course in early Christianity.
We see his dramatic conversion, his bold claims of authority, this fierce defense of the true gospel.
And at the heart of it all is this central theme of grace.
Paul is fighting tooth and nail against any attempt to add extra requirements onto the message of salvation through Christ alone.
It's not about what you do, it's about what Christ has already done for you.
Such a powerful message.
It really challenges our human tendency to try to earn our way to God.
We want to prove our worthiness through our actions or by following all the rules.
But Paul throws all of that out the window.
He says, no, it's a gift. It's freely given.
All you have to do is receive it.
It's incredibly liberating.
It frees us from that burden of trying to be good enough.
And allows us to rest in God's love and grace.
It also levels the playing field.
Doesn't matter where you come from, what you've done, your social status.
God's grace is available to everyone equally.
And that was a radical idea in Paul's time.
Especially with that debate about whether Gentile converts to Christianity had to adopt Jewish practices.
Like circumcision.
Paul was adamant that those things were not essential for salvation.
He wanted to break down those barriers.
To create a truly inclusive community.
Where everyone was welcome.
Regardless of their background.
It's amazing to think about how that vision shaped the development of Christianity.
Paul's idea of an inclusive faith helped to make it what it is today.
And it's a challenge for us, too.
To be more welcoming, more accepting, more inclusive in our own faith communities.
So we've got this message of grace and this vision of an inclusive community.
But Paul also stresses the importance of standing firm in the truth.
Even when it's unpopular or controversial.
He faced a lot of opposition back then.
People disagreed with him.
They wanted to twist the message of Christ.
But Paul never backed down.
He never compromised on what he believed.
He was willing to risk everything.
His relationships, his reputation, his safety.
All to defend the gospel.
That's some serious commitment.
It reminds us that sometimes doing what's right comes at a cost.
It might mean going against the crowd.
Speaking truth to power.
Being willing to face rejection.
But Paul's example shows us it's worth it.
Truth is worth fighting for.
Even when it's hard.
Even when it's unpopular.
And sometimes standing firm isn't about being loud or argumentative.
It's about living out our faith authentically.
Letting our actions speak louder than our words.
Being a living example of God's love and grace.
Now, there's a really beautiful image at the end of this passage.
Paul mentions that the Jewish Christians in Judea were glorifying God because of his transformation.
It's like a ripple effect.
His encounter with Christ had this positive impact on others.
Even those who had once been his targets.
It reminds us that our lives can touch others in profound ways.
We never know how God might use us.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Galatians 1:1-4, what stands out to you the most?
Paul's story reminds us that no matter where we've been or what we've done, God's grace can reach us and change us.
And it reminds us that truth matters.
It's worth fighting for.
Well said. So as we move forward, I hope we can carry with us the fire of Paul's conviction, the humility of his transformation, and the unwavering belief in the power of the gospel. Couldn't agree more. Well, one last thought. If Paul were alive today, What other gospels do you think he'd be warning us against? What distortions of the message of grace might he call us to resist?
It's something to think about as we continue to seek truth, embrace grace, and live out our faith.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Galatians. It's been a great conversation.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep seeking the truth that sets us free.